Good evening and welcome to the All Hamptons Read program, What is the Role of Museums in Community History and Legacy, drawing from the themes in the novel Station 11, the selection for this year's Community Read. I'm Julie Bartlett Nelson of Forbes Library. We are recording tonight's program, which is part of the NEA Big Read Cumtic Valley, a program of the National Endowment for the Arts in partnership with Arts Midwest. Our panelists tonight join you from homes and institutions that stand on Nonotuck land. We also acknowledge our neighboring Indigenous nations, the Nipmuc and the Wampanoag to the east, the Mohegan and Pequot to the south, the Mohegan to the west, and the Abenaki to the north. We pay our respects to Indigenous elders, past and present, of these communities and any others who may be here today. This is and always will be Indigenous land. We do have automated closed captioning turned on for our program this evening. And if you have any technical questions, there are two Forbes staff members in the back end of the program that you can send a private chat message to if you're having trouble or if you need to turn on or off those captions. We do have a small group here tonight. We'll be doing some panel discussion with the moderator amongst the panelists, and then we will open it up for question and answers after that. You will have the opportunity to, at any point, put your questions in the chat box, and then we will also open it up where you can raise your hand virtually or physically and may ask your own question as well. So I'll now turn us over to our program moderator for this evening, Pleun Bouricius.
Hi, everyone. It's nice to see so many faces. Welcome to this program. I wanted to read you a little quote from the, before we start, I wanted to read you a tiny little quote from Station 11, and because I think it's a lot what we're going to be taking on tonight. There seemed to be a limitless number of objects in the world that had no practical use, but that people wanted to preserve. Cell phones with their delicate buttons, iPads, Tyler's Nintendo console, a selection of laptops. There were a number of impractical shoes, stilettos mostly, beautiful and strange. There were 3 car engines in a row, cleaned and polished, a motorcycle composed mostly of gleaming chrome. We're going to be talking tonight about what is a museum, what is in a museum, what is a museum for, and we have 4 wonderful panelists. And I think what we're going to do is first ask them to introduce themselves a little bit, one by one, and talk a little bit about the museum that they are associated with. And then we will do a little bit of panel discussion. And after that, as we get further into the panel discussion, you should feel free to join in on the discussion. I'm sure that there are plenty of you who have plenty to say on the topic as well. I'm going to introduce each of them in turn, and then they're going to talk for a little bit. And the first person I wanted to introduce is Betty Sharpe. Elizabeth Sharpe has been the co-director of Historic Northampton since 2016. Her museum career began as an intern at the Smithsonian's National Museum of American History, where she later serves as Deputy Assistant Director for Public Programs. She teaches history in the Commented course in the Humanities at the Care Center in Holyoke, in a program which helps low-income women go to college. Her PhD in the history of American civilization is from the University of Delaware, and her master's is from the Cooperstown Graduate Program in Museum Studies. She is the author of In the Shadow of the Dam, the Aftermath of the Mill River Flood of 1874. Welcome, Betty.
Welcome. Our story at Historic Northampton is one of an individual collector. Sometimes it's not the institution that starts the collecting, it's the individual. So one of the main stories at Historic Northampton is the Shepherd House, which is, if you're looking at all 3 of our houses, it's the one furthest to the right. And a couple lived there, Thomas Shepherd and his wife, Edith. Thomas and Edith traveled widely all over the world and collected all kinds of artifacts, ethnographic baskets, gongs, all kinds of things. And what Thomas did was he left in his will money to build the Shepherd Museum on their grounds, which would be right on Bridge Street. And it was to look like a Greek temple, and you were to be able to see it from the street. And all these things that they'd collected were going to be in there for the education of everyone, mostly children in Northampton. The way to learn about the world was through artifacts. Lo and behold, his wife dies 40 years later. And what she does instead is she gets the two women who live next to her. So in the White House, which is now Parsons House, and the Yellow House, which is Damon House, she gets descendants of those families to turn their houses over to the Northampton Historical Society. So she essentially created what is our property and most of the artifacts in it. She went around and collected all over town. She collected a lot of clothing. And the interesting thing about it is, of course, it has the Northampton provenance. So our collection is really one of the best in the country because we know who the people are behind the collections. So instead of like institutional collecting, the base of our collection comes from just a few people. Well, just our neighbors, actually, on our property.
Thanks, Betty. Penni Martorell is a professional archivist and curator of collections at Wistariahurst Museum in Holyoke. Martorell has been Holyoke city historian since 2010. Her work at Wistariahurst includes organizing history exhibits and lecture series, presenting local history lectures to various community organizations and schools, and managing the collections at Wistariahurst Museum. She leads genealogy and research workshops, conducts information literacy classes, presents on heirloom and textile preservation and exhibition techniques, and consults on archival best practices. She lectures on Holyoke's industrial history, the textile and paper industry history, and the Skinner family. Welcome, Penni.
Hi, everyone. How are you? So Wistariahurst has an interesting history. It was originally the Skinner family home. The Skinners were mill-owning family in Holyoke, and Holyoke was really set up as a planned industrial city. And so the geography of the city reflects that. And Skinner's house is an example of what the mill owners lived like. But with Holyoke over the years, the demographics shifting in Holyoke, we are more than 50% Latino population. And of that Latino population, a good majority of that is Puerto Rican. And so the house was left with a stipulation to be used as an educational resource for the city and the community. And so under recent administration, we've tried to shift our collecting focus to things that relate to our neighbors, our community now. So there's a bit of a disconnect between, the Puerto Rican population that lives there now and the Skinner family history that goes with the house. And so part of our collecting for the archive has been more recent history, mid 20th century history. And we have several collections, regular Holyoke history. We have the Carlos Vega collection on Latino history in Holyoke. And so that's like the premier collection of Latino history in Holyoke. And we have textiles, and we have the Skinner family history. So it's kind of a odd collection of collections, but really interesting collection. And we do a lot of work with students from 5 colleges and Holyoke Community College, as well as, our local population. So yeah, it's interesting working there, and the kind of things that we collect are different than, say, the history room that's at the library. And so I'm really looking forward to this discussion tonight.
Thanks, Penni. Welcome. The third person I'm going to introduce is actually our host. Julie Bartlett Nelson has been the archivist at Forbes Library since 2004. She manages the collections in the Hampshire Room for Local History and Genealogy, as well as the Calvin Coolidge Presidential Library and Museum. Her duties include collecting, cataloging, creating exhibits, research, teaching, lectures, museum tours, and public programs. Her research interests include 19th and 20th and early 20th century history, Pioneer Valley history, census records, and assisting people with their family histories. Her master's thesis was on Lydia Maria Child's American Frugal Housewife and the start of the cookbook genre. Welcome, Julie. That's kind of weird for me to say to you.
Thank you. Welcome to all of you tonight. So Forbes Library is the public library for the city of Northampton. We opened in 1894. One of the earliest librarians, Joseph Harrison, was there from 1912 to 1950, and he ferociously collected everything and anything he could about Greater Northampton community and its people. He was collecting documents, diaries, manuscripts, maps. He was a great photographer, and he was in a photography club and got many early photos into our collection. One of the key people that he was collecting was local politician Calvin Coolidge. He first met Coolidge when he was mayor, and then went on to state senator, lieutenant governor, governor, vice president, and president. And he worked with Coolidge's White House staff to keep sending materials to Forbes Library to establish what became a permanent room for the Coolidge Collections in 1956. So today, the Calvin Coolidge Presidential Library and Museum, we develop, provide access to, and preserve the historical materials and artifacts related to Calvin and Grace Coolidge, the presidency and its lasting impact. And our mission is to provide opportunities for the public to engage, facilitate conversation, and stimulate interactions on civics, history, both of the Coolidge's lives and political work, and also connecting to current events.
Thanks, Julie. I'm going to introduce our final panelist, Sara Lennox. Sara Lennox taught German studies and directed a social justice program at UMass until she retired in 2012. She's been a board member at Historic Northampton since 2014 and at the David Ruggles Center for History and Education in Florence since 2015. She's also a board member for Northampton Neighbors, an organization that helps seniors remain in their homes as they age, and of the Western Massachusetts Sacred Harp community. Her PhD is in comparative literature from the University of Wisconsin, and her scholarship focuses on women's writing and feminist theory, colonial and post-colonial studies, and Black German history and literature. Welcome, Sara.
Thank you. So my job, or the museum I'm representing tonight is the David Ruggles Center. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about that. So the David Ruggles Center for History and Education is a small museum in Florence that focuses on the memory of the radical abolitionist utopian community dedicated to racial, gender, and economic equality that existed in Florence in the 1840s. The David Ruggles Center was founded about 10 years ago. That was before my involvement with it. But I think I can say more or less by 60s people who believed in the ideals that the utopian community represented. We call ourselves a museum of ideas rather than a museum of things, so we don't collect objects. Instead, our museum features exhibits on African-American abolitionists like David Ruggles and Sojourner Truth, on the white abolitionist Lydia Maria Child, and on the local Underground Railroad. We also offer walking tours of Florence, on which we tell the stories of people, including self-emancipated former enslaved people and free Blacks. And it's interesting that in the 1840s, Black people made up about 10% of the population of Florence, though that dropped enormously in 1850 after the passage of the Fugitive Slave Act, when many of them went to Canada for their own safety. So we offer walking tours which focus on Black people in Florence, among other people who were drawn to Florence by desire to create and live in a more just society. And we point out where those people lived and worked. We've designed an interactive curriculum for middle and high school students that allows them to work with primary sources to teach themselves about this history. And finally, we feature events that connect this radical history to issues of the present day.
Thank you, Sara. So the thing you said when you started, Sara, which is to say that you are a museum of ideas rather than a museum that collects objects. That's going to be, I think, the focus of the first part of what we're going to talk about tonight. And the question that I have for everyone to put answers and responses in the chat is, what do you think is a museum? What should be in a museum? Should it be objects? Should it be ideas? What is the task of a museum? So I'm hoping that as many as you have ideas on that will respond in the chat and just put a couple of words in so that we can pick up on those as we move forward. Any thoughts on that? So while we are all putting some thoughts in the chat, I haven't seen, strangely enough, my chat is completely empty. Is that?
You mean, maybe you should say, Pleun, that it's we're hoping the audience will respond.
Yes, the audience, that everybody will put some ideas in the chat. I'm sorry if I didn't make that clear. You know, while we are thinking about that and you're thinking about that, I'm going to ask the panelists to talk about whose stuff do museums collect? What is the objective of putting stuff in museums? What makes the question of what museums collect so important? Is that changing? And what are the hot potatoes? That's sort of the first barrage of questions. You know, is it always the same over time? I see people saying museums collect historical artifacts. Penni says high examples of ideas, art, mechanics. Someone talks about digital archives, which is, I guess, I'm wondering if digital archives are in some ways really archives. Sheila Damcolor says objects that are of value in some way, whether for memory, beauty, reflecting ordinary life, pain, the whole range of human experience. So I'm going to ask the panelists to address this question. And I'm hoping to start with Penni. Are you willing to start with that? What should be in a museum? Whose stuff is in it? What's the objective?
Yeah. So in our example, we have a lot of photographs, a lot of documentation, because Holyoke is has such a young history, being established in 1850 and as a city incorporated in 1873. We have a lot of material from those initial years. And it tells the white industrial mill owner's story for the most part. And that story gets told over and over in Holyoke. And the majority of people who live in Holyoke now are not white Irish folks who worked on building those canals. And so, we've made a thoughtful effort to shift our collecting so that it reflects more of the people who live in the community now. And not only that, but collecting things that are of importance to the community now. And one of the ways that we've done that is to set up a volunteer panel of folks who advise us, a collections advisory committee. So people from the Latino community, people from Irish heritage. But the one part that was significant to me was that we have a young person, either from high school or the community college, making those collection decisions. Because what I think is important, I'm not a Holyoke resident, so that, you know, in some way discounts what I think is important. You know, people who live and work and, you know, have their lives in the community should be making decisions about what's going to be saved and what's going to be important to the students who are in high school now in 20 or 30 years. You know, I'm not in touch with that at all. So I really need that kind of input. So that's one way of shifting the collecting policies of museums.
So who wants to jump in?
Muted.
There's space is at such a premium.
Mm.
Space is expensive. Someone who was interested in donating some things to us, also came from a museum, said, accepting an artifact is like accepting a horse. You know, you have care and feeding of that thing forever, and it takes up so much resources that I think now in looking for art, and I think people did this in the past, of course, it is look for narrative, look for story, look for something that tells more than the thing itself, unless your topic is pattern and innovation and technology and things like that. But if you want to talk about people, it needs to relate in some way. In terms of the things that we have in the past that may not have appeared that they represented a broader public, sometimes there are those things that do, and you just need to reinterpret them, think about them in a different way. I think for us, there's this wedding dress we have from the 1830s, which the woman was a slaveholder, and she came from the South. The family settled in Northampton and became a prominent family. But it's interesting that she brought it with her, and you just have to think about who would have made that dress to really understand a little bit more about that life. So I think that's important, is to look a little more broadly. And I will just say that digital archives are archives. And in fact, we're doing a lot of collecting in digital archives. And I've been reminded more than once by our collections manager that these things take up space, they cost, and you have to work hard to continue to preserve them into the future. So that's what I'll say.
So I've heard basically two variations, but also differing opinions of what should be in a museum. Penni said basically what should be in a museum is stuff that both reflects the history of a place and is of interest to the people who are here now. And then Betty came into that and said, what we need to have are artifacts that we can do something with, that have ways of telling the story. And then we need to do a good job. And on the other hand, she also said we need to police what we have. Sarah, go ahead.
Yeah, so I think I would like to connect this to Station 11, which is a book I actually love. So I think I would say it's because survival is insufficient. And it's not, so I'd like to say it's not just the traveling symphony and the troupe of Shakespeare actors that underlines that survival is insufficient, but also the Museum of Civilization. However, I think Clark, who set up the Museum of Civilization, doesn't use that term ironically, but it's possible that Mandel in fact does use it ironically, that the whole idea of civilization maybe needs to be questioned a little bit. So I think one thing museums can do in their collection and in their interpretation is ask questions about the dominant civilization and pose alternatives to the dominant civilization. Just as Betty sad Historic Northampton is now doing with respect to this wedding dress. So there's one story about the wedding dress that's about the dominant civilization in the 19th century, and there's a whole other one that draws that into question. And that's the kind of thing that the Ruggles Center is trying to do too.
Julie.
So I think for Forbes Library, our most active collecting right now is in our local history collections. We've been collecting music history in the Northampton area, conducting oral histories, helping people digitize home movies, and collecting the history of everyday people through photographs, through documents, through the pandemic experience of what life has been like in the last year, collecting poetry, and really trying to get a much broader representation of voices within our community. Our Coolidge Collections, there's not as much growth there. We do get things trickle in from attics, basements, as people are moving or discover new items, but that collection doesn't see as much growth. A lot of what we're doing there is we've been doing a self-assessment study for the last year of the Coolidge Museum with a standing committee from our board of trustees, and really taking a look at, you know, what is the Coolidge collection, what is the museum, and what is the legacy and interpretation in 2021 for Coolidge from the 1920s. And a lot of presidential museums, we're not part of the National Archive system. We're completely private with no federal affiliation or money. So for us, a lot of the presidential museums and foundations, you see their president really up on a pedestal. You only see the good. And we really want to show, you know, all of who he was, as well as really taking a look at what some of the lasting legacies of some policies are. For example, the 1924 Immigration Act. What did that mean in the 20s? What has it meant over time? And what does it mean today? And really looking at the impact of the presidency. We have a president's book discussion group, which we started from Washington on up. We're on Garfield now. And so really examining like where is Coolidge's place along this timeline of people? And that group, we've really been learning how flawed all the presidents are. And we've been using a lot of, you know, more modern texts, more revisionist type histories, and narrative nonfiction to really learn about the role of the president.
So what you say, and what Sara said, bring up a question for me, which is the Museum of Civilization in the novel Station 11. Items come to the museum because people bring them, right? Who decides what's in a museum? Some of you have alluded to having committees that make decisions, but who should decide? And I asked before, is, you know, what is the hot potato? Is that a topic people are talking about? You know, is there anything you want to say about that? How should we go about making those decisions? Any of you care to pick that up? All right, go ahead, Penni.
The only thought that came to my mind is, so Wistariahurst is a department of the city of Holyoke. So we are a public trust. So when the city of Holyoke decided to establish Wistariahurst as a museum department, you know, we have to answer to our taxpayers who want us to collect things. And so it's not just me making those decisions. You know, we want input from the community of what goes into that. But again, like Betty said, space makes a difference. Story. So you have to, the editorialness of being a curator, you know, affects what's in the collection. If I have a fancy for textiles and just decide that I want to fill up my entire textile space, you know, I could kind of steer the committee that way, but you know, who's that doing benefit for, you know? So I have to be conscious of making decisions that are going to be reflective of a much larger audience. Other museums, you know, get pressure from financial funders, you know, of what's going to be collected and how much is going to be collected. So, you know, different sides of coins, you know.
Mm-hmm. So there's this phrase around sharing authority. And, you know, when you're talking, and I know that Wistariahurst happens to be one of the most open museums that I know, and you've played a role in that. But still, I hear you say, I make decisions, right? I'm hearing you say that.
Yes.
So how do we, you know, how do you share, each of you, how do you share authority, and do you share authority, and why?
Yeah, I think Forbes were slightly similar to Wistariahurst in that although Forbes Library is a private 501c3, we do receive tremendous city funding. We are governed by the will of Charles Forbes, our benefactor, but the Board of Trustees, he had set it up so that they are elected by the people on city elections. And so our governing authority is elected by the people. So the similar public trust that we have there, but it is staff and trustees making decisions with a community committee for Coolidge Collections. And we do have a special collections policy that is governed by our trustees as well. So there is quite a bit of community feedback solicited in those policies and decisions as well. There is a new art fund specifically for to collect a more diverse art collection for the public library, our permanent art on the walls. And that was started this year with an anonymous donation that the trustees matched. And there is a public community committee deciding what to collect, what to buy for Black, Indigenous, people of color art for the permanent collection.
I would say that we're at a crossroads. The way the Northampton Historical Society starts in 1905. And so the collections, if you look at them today, they don't go that much past 1880, 1890. You know, there's not even that much in the 20th century, let alone the 21st century. And it really needs to be examined very, very tightly. You know, deaccessioning is a big question, of course. But also, you know, how do we then decide into the future what we're going to do? And our base of discussion needs to be broader, and the policies need to be updated. So we're just starting to help, you know, launch into that and think about how we should really honestly go about it. I can say that just about every single day, something comes in. Do you want this? And sometimes, and so at that case, you know, when it's a very immediate thing, there's just a group of us within the staff who make those decisions based on some guidance that we have. Do we already have it? Do we have space for it? Does it have Northampton provenance? Does it represent a community we don't have anything for? You know, all those kinds of basic questions can be answered pretty quickly. But getting into the larger question of what we should be collecting is really hasn't been done yet. So that's why I'm often thinking a lot about digital collecting, because it's in an immediate sense, it's much faster to go broader and to collect. It's really important, I think, for us to collect today. So just for example, just last week, a local photographer named Paul Schul had said, I'll go to the Northampton Senior Center and I'd love to take portraits of people after they've just gotten their vaccines. So he did that. So just tonight, just with about half an hour ago, they're up on our website. So if you go to our homepage and you click through, you'll see them. And the people, they're masked, but the expressions are just so amazing. Plus his photographs are amazing. They had a chance to write something about how they felt about it. So that's pretty cool. Not only did he get the people getting vaccinated, but a lot of the people who wanted their portraits taken were the people who volunteered there. And so there are many, many of them, and that's really important to document that. We also collected COVID stories and poems. We have about 100 of those on the website. So I think that's really important for us to just jump in before we have the chance to really do the whole survey of what the artifact should be.
Thank you. I wanted to just respond to you for a second, because I heard you say every day something comes in, right? And I
Yes.
was thinking about the people who send you stuff. And
Yes.
Alicia Ralph commented here that to bring an object to a museum is an act of hope, right? It can also be an act of desperation, of course,
Mhm.
like, as in, I have this wonderful china
Put it out of my
I
house.
bought and my kids don't want it. Who wants it? But in general, it's an act of hope for whatever you bring to the
Mhm.
museum. And I'm wondering, is there a way in which some people are predisposed to have more of that hope? Like, who feels free to send you stuff? Or to not just you, but to send stuff to a museum, right? It's like an act of, it's a little bit of an act of hubris as well, right? Like, I or my stuff are important
Mhm.
enough to go into a museum. So
Usually it isn't their stuff.
Right.
So often was their great aunt's, mother's, uncle, whatever, passed down in the family. And these things are wonderful. I'm not saying they're not. Sometimes they're just, you collect like some books and pamphlets of your trip to Colonial Williamsburg, or, something like that. You want to send those. Does the museum want these? But oftentimes it's, that collection of chairs from the great-grandma. Today, it was someone from Midwest or someplace. It was silver passed down in their family with a Northampton connection. Is that something you're interested in? So this happens. So it's often people who don't, or I'm downsizing. People who feel that so attached to objects, people are very attached to objects, don't want to see it go nowhere. Could I entrust it to you? I would feel so good if that could happen.
So it's really your curatorial role of taking care of something.
Yes.
And
yeah, and I can remember what, people coming and saying, either I'm leaving here, no, this object is staying, I'm leaving without this object. Either you keep it or you get rid of it, but I'm leaving here without it. I've had that happen before too.
So I want to briefly shift from the curatorial to the educational role of museums, because several of you have talked about your role in educating the public, or in any case, educating. And I wanted to invite Sara to read a passage from the novel that is really very much about the educational role of a museum. And it also relates to Betty's mentioning of the wedding dress.
Okay, and I just put it in the chat, but I will read it to you too. Let me just find it. Okay. Clark stood by the case and found himself moved by every object he saw there, by the human enterprise each object had required. Consider the snow globe. Consider the mind that invented those miniature storms. The factory worker who turned sheets of plastic into white flakes of snow. The hand that drew the plan for the miniature Severn City with its church steeple and city hall. The assembly line worker who watched the globe glide past on a conveyor belt somewhere in China. Consider the white gloves on the hands of the woman who inserted the snow globes into boxes to be packed into larger boxes, crates, shipping containers. Consider the card games played below decks in the evenings on the ship carrying the containers across the ocean, a hand stubbing out a cigarette in an overflowing ashtray, a haze of blue smoke in dim light, the cadences of half a dozen languages united by common profanities, the sailors' dreams of land and women, these men for whom the ocean was a gray line horizon to be traversed in ships the size of overturned skyscrapers. Consider the signature on the shipping manifest when the ship reached port, a signature unlike any other on Earth, the coffee cup in the hand of the driver delivering boxes to the distribution center, the secret hopes of the UPS man carrying boxes of snow globes from there to the Severn City Airport. Clark shook the globe and held it up to the light. That's page 255.
Thank you. Such a wonderful passage. You brought it to our attention. You want to talk about it a little bit?
Yeah, so I would say with reference to museums that objects are congealed human enterprise, or maybe the memories of human enterprise in object form. And so what we can do as curators and interpreters of those objects is show, just like this passage does, show all the human enterprise that went into creating this object, transporting this object, getting it to the point that it was delivered to the museum and came into our hands. So like what Betty said about the wedding dress, you know, telling all the way in which, and maybe taking it back even, is it made of cotton? Is it made of silk? How did those things come about? As well as who sewed those little pieces together. And maybe what was the wedding like, you know? What was the woman like who wound up married to that slave owner, and so on.
So that suggests to me, in some ways, that the educational, how am I trying to say this? Does the educational role of a museum specifically focus on the objects and unpacking them? Is there more of a role for a museum? Is everything you do tied to the objects or things that are in your museum?
No, I mean, that would be, I think, kind of narrow. I think for us, we see the entire land. Because I'm a co-director with a naturalist, we see the entire city as our palette. That's our entire collection. It's landscape, it's geology, it's everything that feeds in together. So in fact, tomorrow we're both coordinating walking tours of Northampton State Hospital, where I'll do the human history and she'll do the natural history. And so the way that whole space is created, she'll talk about that, and that makes a big difference in how the whole thing was set up. So it's important. So no, I don't think it's just about particular objects. I think it's much broader than that.
Penny, go ahead.
I was going to say that the educational role that we choose to take is helping people use their critical thinking skills. It's not actually knowing what stitches are made or what, how a snow globe is made, but to think about, like, what is this thing and who made it and what are all the pieces, to just use all those questions that come up to learn about an object. We have a lot of objects in our collection. I don't even know what they are. Like, the cataloging that was done previously was not always great. And so, you're trying to figure out, what is this thing and why do we have it? Like, where's the story here? And it's just as much fun for me to give that to students and say, what do you think it is? Where do you think it belongs? Why do you think we have it? Just to get their thought processes going and looking at things differently than just, it's just an object. Like Sara was saying, all those different things that come into play of making that object. Yeah.
So I'm almost hearing these two major streams, one of which is really your role as an educator in people looking at mostly in a particular place. What happened here and what happens today, and how do they relate to and stack up to each other and all the human activity as well as the nature, etc. And then on the other hand, you have these collections, which are, I wouldn't want to say that they're indifferent. They're very important because they also have, of course, they carry within themselves the limited ability to understand the past, right? I mean, we can't understand what we have nothing about. It's very difficult. This is one of the difficulties of diversifying the collections. But nonetheless, it's almost a matter of accident what it is that you have to work with, whether it is the snow globe or the wedding dress in some ways. Really interesting. So in the novel, the past gets erased in some ways, right? The past gets erased because you can't get to it. All these items that they're talking about in the museum, they don't function anymore. In the same way, or is that the same way in which a plow that the Plainfield Historical Society has from, or a seeding machine from 1850 doesn't function anymore? You know, is that good? Is that bad? What is the role of a museum in essentially reinventing the past? Is there an advantage to erasing the story that you've been handed down about your bridal dress and coming up with a new one? What do we do with a dead iPhone with no electricity?
I think the purpose of having these objects is to try to define, find the meaning in them, the value that they held to the people, the belief that they had. I feel like the artifact is a three-dimensional real thing, but it's surrounded by emotion and feelings and love, hate, you know, all kinds of things. And I think our job is to try to figure out how to get to that, because that's what's interesting about it. It's what it meant to people. And that meaning changes over time. And the fact that it changes is interesting too. And so that's where I think we want to go, because it's really just about people. It's not about stuff.
Yeah.
That's really eloquent.
Yeah, nice job, Penni.
I think with that, I should open it up to the floor. If anybody have any questions that they want to ask any one of these of our wonderful panelists, or any or all of them. Stick up your hand, make a noise, put something in the chat. Go ahead, Lisa.
Yeah, I'm just curious about, you know, one practical consideration in terms of what's saved and what's lost as time moves on is the fragility of objects, and how that has played into, it hasn't played a role in your collections in terms of things that you can't really you don't have access to because they've gone away. And I think another part of that is maybe things that at the time that did not seem valuable or consequential to anyone, but now looking back, you're like, I wish we had a record of that part of the story.
Who wants to take it?
Well, I think for some objects we have in our collections, we have some very old catalog cards that were written, you know, by the staff person who accepted it as the original gift and put lovely notes on it, or there's a handwritten letter from the donor explaining items. And then there's other things that I have no idea how they came to be in the collection. There's some things that are listed maybe on an old annual report to the library. And then every once in a while you open a box and you say, what is this and where did it come from? And, we don't have its provenance. We don't have its history. We have to guess, or, we know what it is as an object, but we don't know the story of how it got there or who owned it, or why they chose the library. We also have stuff today that just arrives in our book drop or arrives on our doorstep, or it comes in a paper bag left at the desk with my name on it, and that's it. And I have no idea what to make of some things. I think for some of those is that, knowing your colleagues at other institutions too, of who collects what and what is where, and sharing these newfound things or these new donations or mystery objects that somebody else might have a clue about. Retired staff who remember items that were on display once, but sometimes those labels are gone.
Penny?
Yeah, one of the reasons I went into library and archives was because I read about a book of hours that was, hand painted book of hours in France that was put away in an archive, and it was sealed up so that it was never going to be taken out again. They had a digital facsimile of it. They had a regular facsimile of it, but the physical thing was never, it was so fragile. It was put away, never to be seen again. And that got me thinking, like, why do we have it then? Like, why do we keep it? The caves of Lascaux, we can't go in there anymore. There's a facsimile you can go to, but you can't actually go to the original place. And just this week, I've been working with textiles, and I'm like, some of these textiles are never going to come out of this box because they're so fragile. And it's like, well, why do we have them? And there is a lot of learning that can be learned, a lot of things you can learn from a textile in fragile condition of, how to take care of things better, how to store them properly, how to, there's a lot of learning that can take place even with things that are very fragile. But yeah, I mean, what do museums do with the things that are so fragile that we're not going to put them out? We're always balancing access and preservation. Yeah.
Any other questions? Let's see, Sheila had a thought. Sheila, you want to say it? It's a little long for me to read it, so why don't you talk about it? Sheila?
I type fast, so I type a lot. So I was just thinking in Station 11, there was, the question came up at some point, wondering, if it was harder for people who actually had a memory of the past than, the younger people that just didn't remember it at all, never knew the old world. So, I'm thinking about objects in museums, if you see something that, relates to your own experience, versus someone else that, has had no experience with that kind of object, whether it's a historical object or a piece of art, and how as educators and curators, we can bridge that gap to help people who don't immediately see a connection and see, really, we probably could say we are all connected to every object in some way. We can almost always find a way to be connected. So I don't know, just thinking about that and wondering if you had thoughts about that.
Anyone of you want to say something about it?
I was just going to say that, what Betty said is really sums it up. It's about the people and the emotions. It's not about the thing so much, but Betty, go ahead.
Oh, no, I have a different tack on that. I think it's really important for people to understand how stuff works. So I always really like pre-industrial technology or early industrial technology to understand something. And so many times that just sparks a lot of interest for people. And so we were talking about this in relation to the book, how come these people can't survive or struggle to survive, can't they make a dam, can't they, just do any kind of simple thing like that to, make power or something else? How can people have completely forgotten all this kind of human activity, engineering, whatever? And that's important for the old stuff so that we keep and understand how the world works.
Elsa, go ahead. Oh, I can't hear you.
Oh, can you hear me?
Yes.
I joined a bit late, so I'm not sure if this was touched on. But I was just curious, in like the terms of living in 2021, as sort of like history moves forward, we're telling stories about the past, and more technology and software become like part of hardware, and software become part of the stories that we're telling. And this may be relevant to different of those on the panel in different ways, but yeah, I was just curious, like, if that is part of any of your work, or if you see any specific technical challenges in museums and archives who maybe haven't been dealing with as virtual kind of like internet things, but now it's like that's becoming like more of like reality, and like if there's a shift happening in your work.
Yeah. Just today, I was wishing that we had augmented reality. So thinking about Northampton State Hospital, I mean, you go up to Village Hill now and the roads are different and it's filled with all kinds of housing. But the old fountain has been reproduced and is there. And so I would love to be able that people could stand there and look out, because we have the amazing photographs of Old Main, and see it. Just see it in the space. So I think these technology things have so much promise for teaching history. It's just great. On the other hand, in terms of technology changes, we got boxes of cassette tapes that need to be dealt with too. So we need to constantly upgrade.
That's one thing the novel really brought home to me, is that our communications are certainly not going to be saved the way the letters were saved by some people, of course, in the middle of the 20th century. But even then, the paper got so bad that they're going to be gone too, right? So there's definitely, for me, there's a fear that the more and more that our reality becomes virtual and dependent on electricity, and is very ephemeral that way, that we're losing our past as we're living it in some ways. And I don't know, I mean, some museums collect people's digital expression, but I don't know of any that just collect all social media or
Well,
private.
Forbes does.
Yeah, so it's not my project, it's Dylan Gaffney's project with the Internet Archive, and it's called Community Webs. And that project, basically, we have it set up with various websites that we're constantly crawling and saving different websites. We're saving social media of ourselves, so the library's channels, different community groups, the city itself, and trying to capture and save that material. That was a very large grant from Internet Archive, and they've extended it. So it keeps going that way. But then it was also building oral histories. And he has a project of Bay State music. And so all the music that was at the Bay State Hotel played for over decades, and collecting things from people's attics and basements and garages of posters, but the cassette tapes, the videotapes of shows, and being able to digitize those before they're lost, before we can't convert them in the format. But the challenge then today is saving a video of a music show on somebody's iPhone or somebody's TikTok dance. And what do we do with that, and how do we save that? So I think the challenge of how much of it to keep, we can't, just like physical objects, we can't keep everything. We don't have the storage capacity for everything. And then how do we decide you know, which digital objects to keep, you know, and then preserve and keep going so that we can access them in a year, in 10 years, and potentially down the road. So we're, you know, I think we're figuring out as we keep doing it. But then also as people say, well, what about this? What about that? And so a lot of community input into what to save and what to collect as well.
I certainly think that the internet has, excuse me, has also brought the ability to do a great amount of narrative and that we didn't know existed. I mean, think of all the ship's manifests, all the stuff that's in Ancestry that people are constantly now weaving stories out of.
Right.
And if you think about it, I mean, that's history that was not collected, right? I mean, in the sense that many of the people who are the subject of those stories, they didn't have silver that they passed down, or photo albums that somebody thought were important, or did daguerreotypes or whatever, but they did end up on a ship's manifest, and somehow people are being able to trace it. So in some ways, you lose some and you win some, I suppose. Are there any other questions? How are we doing for time, Julie? It's 8:03. Where are we on our?
Yep, we're good. We can take more questions.
Okay, good.
I think we do have somebody by phone too, so feel free to
Just want to
unmute.
speak up, yeah. I don't see any other questions.
Oh.
There is a hand. Am I
Yep.
missing one?
Faith had a question.
Okay, Faith, go ahead. I don't see.
I do. This discussion has been fascinating, and it reminded me of the time capsule that is in the Coolidge Museum now, or in the special collections of Forbes Library. It was put away. I'm not sure when. Julie will know exactly how long ago, and then taken out again when a building was taken down. Is that right? And so the time capsule is sort of related to a museum in the sense that people are gathering objects, artifacts of the present time to communicate with the future. And then when you open it in the future and you look at it and like, why were these things significant or what? And I'm wondering if, like, in a sense, that some museum collecting, especially when we're talking about collecting the present for the future, or when people collected their contemporaneous things like the wedding dress, thinking this is going to be interesting in the future, that it's sort of like a time capsule. You had any thoughts?
So the time capsule that you're thinking of, it was a box that was placed in the cornerstone of Old Main at Northampton State Hospital. And it was put in 1850 as the cornerstone of the building. When they were demolishing the building, the challenge was they knew it was supposed to be, they knew it existed. And the contractors were looking for it, but there had been many additions to the front of the building and a few facade changes. So exactly where that original, what they called the cornerstone was a challenge to find it. And it was fascinating to be able to uncover that and open that up. I had no idea what I would find opening it up. It did have to go through a decontamination for you know, asbestos, and you know, they had a whole process that had to go through before we were allowed to even open it. And from newspaper articles, we had some sense of what was supposed to be in there. And we found a lot of mud and dirt and wet paper. But we did go through a process of, we saved every item that was in the box. We froze it in a process to freeze all the wet paper and then slowly dry it out. So we could inventory what was there. We weren't able to save everything, but there were some things in there that were not unique, that there were copies of reports or newspapers elsewhere. But it was fascinating of, they had a list of what they wanted to put in there, and then some items they must have thrown in there at the last minute on that day. So it was kind of a neat collection there of sort of their dedication of the building and what papers they thought were important about the construction of the hospital or establishing the hospital and getting it started, and what they decided to throw in there. And unfortunately, they did not throw in blueprints or like original floor plans to the building. And that's what everybody had really hoped for. But it's interesting, the decisions of what thing, it was that day's paper was thrown in there. So somebody must have had it in hand when they came to the ceremony. But yeah, what goes in there. I do recommend to anybody when they're talking about time capsules is don't actually bury it. Put it in a box, put it on a shelf, and give it to the library, but don't actually put it in the ground.
Don't bury your buried treasure.
Yeah, I mean, just so we know where it is, but also to preserve it, put it in the climate controlled archive room of the library, and, you'll reveal it in X amount of time. But I don't recommend burying them in the ground or in a building anymore.
Are there any other topics? We haven't spoken at all about the pandemic. Is there time for us to talk about that a little bit? In Station 11, the Museum of Civilization is one of the responses to losing connection and losing everything. And here we are, the book was chosen before the pandemic, and here we are in the pandemic, or at least we're sort of edging towards, at least for us here in North America, we're edging towards the end of the worst aspects of the pandemic, we hope. But there was an enormous amount of activity on the, I've hardly ever seen museum people so excited. Everybody was crushed, but also really excited when the pandemic started and everybody had to go home. Do you want to talk a little bit, as a last topic, a little bit about what role museums can play in the community and in strengthening what's happening in the response?
I think for us, it was about collecting this time, and collecting in all different kinds of medium that, well, digital, but medium we hadn't collected before. Kids' art, poetry. One family did haiku, and they were done by family members all over the country. So it was kind of fun. So they're all up on the website. And in doing so, we first partnered with the Gazette, and then we partnered with Forbes Library. So there was more of a draw. So I think that's important, to just be that kind of place that can document it. The other thing we were able to do is we have a really wonderful grounds, and we welcomed all the neighbors and everyone to hang out. This is our green space, safe place to do that. So
one of the things that, go ahead, Sara.
So I would say, I think I'd like to talk about something that happened parallel to the pandemic, and that is George Floyd's murder and Black Lives Matter. And I think that's put the work of the Ruggles Center in a different light. And I think of a lot of museums, that we're kind of thinking differently about our responsibility and where are we situated vis-a-vis white supremacy, and how can we work to counter that. So I think that's also been very productive for museums. I mean, very painful, but also very productive.
I would agree. It was sort of like a time of rethinking and retooling and regrounding and recentering. I think it's given us a chance to to do that. And that has really pushed us. That's been great, helpful.
Yeah, I mean, I think new ways to connect with the public. Fortunately for the Coolidge Museum, we did have a short little virtual tour already online that we could share with people, but not having people in our physical space. How do we bring it to them? How do we bring research to people? Our research collections. And I think engaging with people on Zoom, or, at the beginning of the pandemic, we were in our own homes, Zooming with people, talking about collections or the research. And then when we could get back in our archive, is still connecting online with people. So I think people's are embracing technology more in terms of reference activities and research activities, but it's how do we get more and more online for people, for our local audience, but also our national and international audiences. And then, what do people want for programming? We've had to learn as we go a lot of what programs make sense online and what ones don't. And really how to engage with people in this little Zoom box world that we're in. And, we're not having programs back in our space yet. But, we all had to learn how to do Zoom. We all had to learn how to live stream a program, or we're recording tonight. So figuring out how to get this on YouTube later and share it out to the world. And, but just really connecting to that audience when they're not there for a tour.
To really, and what I saw, I think in the response to George Floyd and the Black Lives Matter protests, and the question of racism in our society, as well as in the response to the pandemic, I saw this sense that in the community, there was a lot of feeling of we are living in an extraordinary moment, and we better document it. And so how are we going to document it? And I think a lot of people have made some strides in thinking about how to document a community, how to, who to work with, how to give authority to perhaps organizers of protests. What do they want to be collected from this? It seems to me that like the 1950s were like a heyday of administration, right? Everybody knew how to administer and how to make file cabinets and all that sort of stuff. And so documentation was like an office activity, right? And people thought about that, and they kept their papers, and they, people like Carlos Vega, they kept until the 1970s, right? They kept their stuff. They were aware of that something extraordinary was going on, and sort of that feeling seemed to have been less widespread for a while, and that I really seem to be feeling that was coming to the fore. And I think that's a great idea. The more we can encourage people to do that, to think about it in smart ways, right? What are we up to now? What does it mean to the future?
But in Holyoke, we kind of were right out of the gate with trying to collect online experiences of the pandemic, and did not get a very big response. And when we look back at it, it's like, this shared trauma is going to take a while for people to process. And so it's not something that we're collecting right now, but in a year, I expect that we'll have more and more information coming in that people recognize themselves having gone through this traumatic pandemic, that it is that their thing or their words or their ideas that they've saved are going to be important. So.
I think when Betty says new stuff comes to them every day, I think we do get offers of material. I think people have been thinking long and hard at home about their own connections to stuff, their own spaces, and what's happening there. People that have been reading Marie Kondo, and, does it spark joy? And so what is my relationship with stuff? They're home all the time and taking a look at their space.
Yeah.
I want to thank you all, I think, for a wonderful discussion. And I want to thank everybody who is participating. Julie, you said this is going to be online in about a week.
Yes, so we are recorded, and if you registered for the program with an email, we'll send out an email with the recording. It'll be on the Forbes Library YouTube channel and available probably sometime next week. So thank you all for coming tonight.
Thank you. Thank you for hosting.
Thank you.
It was fun.
Really great.
Thank you.
Yep.
Bye.
Bye-bye.